Okay, so sea slugs are really, really special. And tonight I'm not going to be going overly into the science. I'm not going to have lots of slides with text. We're going to look at some beautiful sea slugs. We're going to be talking about how to find them on the shore and how to look at them in order to identify what species they are. And we'll be looking at various groups of slugs that we find on the shore, what they eat, what's special about them, and they are a pretty weird and wonderful group of creatures. So here we go. Mike's already introduced me beautifully. Thank you, Mike. I do a lot of work out on the shore. I just like being out in the rock pools. I don't have a marine biology background. I studied languages, but I grew up on the north coast of Cornwall. I'm now based on the south coast of Cornwall, and I have always absolutely loved sticking my head into rock pools. It's what I've always done. I do a lot of volunteering for Cornwall Wildlife Trust and for my local marine conservation group here in Looe, which is quite similar to Shores of South Devon. And I run events for the junior branch of Cornwall Wildlife Trust, taking kiddies out on the beach to discover things. And I have to say, when I take kids out, it's very often the parents who get most involved and don't want to leave at the end of the day. So the photo on the left is over at Trianon on the north coast, looking at starfish and things. I've written a couple of books. I'll show you pictures of them at the end. And the photo there, I'm holding my new book, which is for children, and it's all hands-on activities to try and get kids really out there exploring and discovering beaches for themselves, how beaches are made, all the different animals that live there. I run a blog, as Mike said. If you just put Cornish Rock Pools into Google, my website and the blog come up. The blog is just under latest news, and you can sign up to follow that if you haven't already. I share all kinds of weird and wonderful creatures that I find on the beaches, mostly around Cornwall, but sometimes when I'm off exploring other places as well. And I'm hoping to make it up to South Devon at some point soon to explore some of the fabulous beaches that I've been hearing about. I'm based in Looe in southeast Cornwall, so not a million miles away from South Devon, really. We're very lucky here to have a extremely sheltered shore, which is completely different from the one that I grew up with in North Cornwall, which was very wave battered. So different species. We have in Looe a big wide bay that's protected by Looe Island to some extent, and by Rame Head in the distance. And we have quite a lot of loose rocks and rocky gullies, which create a perfect habitat for all sorts of creatures, including slugs, much to my delight, because I've always been a big fan of slugs. So that's the area that most of the photos that you'll see tonight have come from. Some of them are from other places, but especially in the last couple of years with the lockdowns, I've been spending an inordinate amount of time on my local beach in East Looe. And it's been an eye-opener, actually, because sometimes if you just go back to the same place and look really closely, you keep finding new things and things you didn't imagine could be there. And I think that's a good message if you're looking for slugs and maybe haven't found many on the shore or any on the shore yet, to slow down and look at the same place and look at it really closely. You'll be surprised how many different things you'll find. Okay, so last year Tamsin gave a fabulous talk, which I listened to, about the slugs that you find offshore. So on the shore, we find a surprising variety of things as well. As you'll all know, the tide goes out twice a day, and on the lowest tides, the lowest part of the beach that is exposed is really underwater for most of the year, which means that you can find almost anything there. But you also do find slugs towards the top of the beach, and I'll be taking you through a few of those as we go along. This is my son here in the picture quite a few years ago now, where he's as tall as me now, which is terrifying. Sporting his Christmas pudding hat, to show that you can go rock pooling at any time of year, and it's possible to find slugs at any time of year, although the spring and early summer are a really good time when they're coming onto shore to spawn. It's certainly possible to come across slugs at any time of year at all. This was taken at Port Wrinkle Beach on an extremely cold day in January when we were actually looking for stalked jellyfish on the beach. We found a lot, and it was snowing that day. It was so cold, but we found all sorts of things. So moving swiftly on to sea slugs, which is what we're all here for. I wanted to speak to you a bit at the start about how to find sea slugs. I know some of you tonight are already expert at these things, but for those of you who might never have seen a sea slug or know quite where and how to look, there are some pretty simple rules to getting started. And I'd say the very first one is look for the food. Okay. So most sea slugs are quite specialist and have a particular thing that they like to eat, either a single animal or a group of animals, or in the case of some of the slugs, plants. But most of our sea slugs are actually carnivores. Most of them, especially all the nudibranchs, tend to eat animals. So you've got the grey sea slug at the top here, which is tucking into an anemone, absolutely face first into the snake clocks anemone at the top of the screen. The bottom left, you've got it's a Rostranga rubra slug. Don't worry, we'll look at what all these are and how to identify them later. But bottom left, you have a Rostranga rubra slug, which really likes to eat red sponges. And you'll see that the animals often take on the colour of the thing that they're eating.
We don't get many Sussex.
So you also have top right, there's a dotto slug, which all of the dotto slugs like to eat hydroids, which are little animals that are related to jellyfish and anemones and have stinging cells, but look a little bit like seaweed, kind of branchy transparent animals. And top left, more of a rarity, not a nudibranch sea slug, this one. The top left one is an Alicia viridis, and we'll have a look at that in a minute. But this is one of the slugs that eats plants, so it eats seaweeds. And this one actually eats almost any seaweed, but is particularly associated with this green, spongy finger seaweed called codium. So one of the key things on the shore is to look for the thing that the slug eats. If you're looking for a particular slug, have a look around the areas where it's most likely to be, which is where its food is. The other thing for spotting slugs is to look for their spawn, to look for their eggs. The eggs of the sea slugs tend to be mostly in a coil shape. They tend to be laid in long strings or coils. So they stand out on the rock. The eggs often look a lot bigger than the animal itself, if that makes sense. So they take up quite a big area, whereas the slug itself may be quite small. So they draw the eye in and are more obvious than the slug. So at the top left here, we've got the egg coil of a great grey sea slug, which is one of our most common ones and one of the largest ones. So you might well find those. Similarly, the top right, these pink spaghetti strings that look a bit like silly string, if you remember the 1980s, that you find on the seaweed. Those are from the sea hare, the Aplysia slugs, which we'll again see in a minute. And the bottom left, another really common set of sea slug eggs that you might find on the shore are these sea lemon eggs. And these are a big coil of eggs, which can be white or yellow or even orange, which I've never been quite sure why. I think like the slugs themselves, it may depend on what the slug's been eating. Okay, so look for the food, look for the eggs. The next little trick for finding a sea slug and making sure it's a sea slug that you found is the magic sea slug rule, which is just add water. Like most sea creatures, especially the soft-bodied ones, the sea slugs need water to hold their structure in place. Outside of the water, they just collapse into a rather sorry-looking heap. They're a bit like anemones. They look like curled-up anemones. So on the left, you have the great grey sea slug, or the sheep slug, as I call it, looking like a bedraggled anemone. And on the right is a very sorry-looking Lamasia clavigera. Obviously, the colours jump out at you, but you can't really see what the slug looks like. So in a very Blue Peter fashion. Here's one I made earlier. Those are the same slugs. So the sheep slug on the left, looking more plumped up and with big rhinophores on top of its head. And we have the Lamassia clavigera, the orange clubbed slug on the right, which you can see it looks completely different to the little bedraggled blob that was on the rock. So those are my 3 tips. Find the food, find the eggs, add water. Okay. Here's a little test for you. There are 2 slugs in this photo and a great big painted top shell. Now, painted top shells, I often notice, like to sit in the same places as slugs. So quite often, because they draw the eye, I find myself taking photos of painted top shells. And unless I remember to look, I miss the slugs. So there are 2 in this photo. See if you can spot the slugs. And this gives you an idea of how small some of them are as well. Okay, I shall reveal my beautifully drawn circles. You see, I can't draw anything. So the top right, you've got a Rostranga rubra slug, the little red slug that feeds on those sponges. I'm not 100% sure what the other one was, but there's another little white and yellow slug, possibly an Ancula gibosa or something like that, just below it as well. So you do need to look really closely and need to remember these slugs are just perfectly camouflaged very often on their regular prey. So the Rostranga rubra, the red slug there, really is very, very hard to spot on that red slug, on that red sponge rather. Got slugs on the brain. So I'll take you through some things that aren't slugs, then things that are slugs but aren't nudibranchs, and then we'll look at the nudibranchs and we'll explain what these are as we go through. So I just want to start with what my son calls Daleks, the Lamellaria, which aren't slugs. They are gastropod snails of a sort, and they have a little internal shell. So if the slug dies, there's a little shell inside that you could find. We call them Daleks because, as you see a bit on the one at the right, it's got a little siphon that points upwards or outwards, like the one on the right. And we always think it looks like a Dalek's gun port. And the Lamellaria often look like they've got sort of sandy, cruddy stuff on top of them. And they vary enormously in colour. They look very much like a slug. Just like the slugs, if you find a blob like that, put it in some water. If it's a Lamellaria, it'll have that little Dalek siphon plus 2 little tentacles on the front. There are a couple of species of Lamellaria that we find on the shore. This is Lamellaria perspicua, the one with the cruddy bits on top that's quite rounded in shape. There's also something called Lamellaria latens, which can look very, very flat on the rock and is always a pale colour. They are extremely similar. There are identification guides out there, but they can be quite difficult to tell apart. One of the key things is the Lamellaria latens doesn't tend to have cruddy bits on top. It doesn't have that sort of sandy, scaly look to the top of it. Another thing that is a slug, but isn't a sea slug in the true sense, is something called the pulmonate slugs. And so this is what's called Oncidella celtica, or the Celtic sea slug. I hope those of you who are good at these things will forgive my Latin tonight. I don't know how to pronounce any of these things. I do it all in my head. So Oncidella celtica is quite a little armoured car, a tank of a slug, just all dark and knobbly. It's got 2 little eyes on stalks, a bit like a garden slug does. And it lives among the barnacles and the mussels on very exposed shores normally, often quite high up the shore. I found them in the sort of mid-shore downwards. Okay, they're rather charming little things. They're not true sea slugs because they breathe air. They actually keep air in little specially designed pockets underneath themselves, and they hide away when the tide comes in and survive on the air that they've kept within their bodies. And they come out to feed when the tide's out. So on exposed north coast shores in Cornwall, you might well come across these. Further north, you're less likely to see them. They're a very southerly species, as far as I know. So we'll move on to the actual sea slugs. So actual sea slugs have gills that they breathe through, like other underwater animals. So we have the pistobranchs, which means to the rear gills, apparently. So these are sea slugs that aren't nudibranchs. So they're sea slugs that don't have exposed gills in the same way as the nudibranchs do. This one is a really common one that we'll look at in a minute, called the plumed bertha, or feathered bertha, as I call her. And we'll see why she's called that in a minute. Most sea slugs are male and female at the same time. So although a lot of them are called Doris and Bertha, it doesn't necessarily mean they're female. They're normally male and female. So we have Elysia viridis here, the solar-powered sea slug. This one's rather lovely. We saw it at the beginning. It feeds on that spongy green sausagey weed called codium and various other seaweeds. Sometimes they're just a very dull brown colour. But if you're lucky, you can find a little one that's got these lovely bright blue spots on it and a green colour. They're called the solar-powered sea slug because they do something weird called kleptoplasty, where they steal the chloroplasts from the food that they're eating and keep them within their skin. And those little chloroplasts are the part of the plant that photosynthesizes and make energy from the sun, which means that when they're kept within the slug's skin, they carry on making energy, carry on making glucose for the slug, which is rather special. Although it's not sort of believed that Elysia viridis completely live off that solar power, most of their energy probably comes from the seaweed that they eat. It means they have a bit of a top up if it's sunny or if the seaweed is scarce. Those lobes in the middle of the sea slug, by the way, they can open right out. It sometimes looks really big and flat when it can open out like solar panels so that it can get the most of the sunlight. And there it is. So sea slugs often have quite a clear eye. You can see their little eyes looking at you. I said to look for the eggs. Those are the eggs of Elysia viridis. You'll often find them on codium weed, so it's worth having a look through the sausage weed, see if you can spot the little white spirals. That tells you that there's a slug there, and then have a look closely for the little blobs. Another great slug to find on the shore, and this one's great because it's so big in the summer. If you go down to the beach in August, you'll often find a lot of really big blobby sea hares. Which are these? It should have an L in there, Aplysia punctata. I can't spell. The sea hares are beautiful. As they get big, they often take on this wonderful leopard print pattern to their skin. They have the big rhinefolds on their heads, which look rather like ears. So they have and the big lobes in the middle that they often hold upright. You see, they get really chunky as the summer goes on, really fat. They can almost fill your hand. And I've had some events where we've had so many on rock pool rambles that children sort of turn up with a bucket half full of them, and we have to put them all back again. They feed on seaweed, and there's plenty of it around in the summer. So as the season goes on, they eat more and more of the stuff and get bigger and bigger. One of the amazing things about sea hares, of course, all of these sea slugs are mollusks, and that means they're related to things like squid and cuttlefish. And the sea hares are one of the few sea slugs which can squirt ink, a bit like a squid does. And the sea hare has this really amazing purple ink. No sea slug was harmed in the making of this photo. This was one that was very dehydrated. It was on a rock, completely out of the water in the middle of the summer, and was dying. We put it in some water and I think it did get going all right after that, but it was very distressed and squirted ink everywhere because it thought it was in major trouble, but it was safely released back to the rock pools. Happy ending. One thing is to look out really early in the season. This was probably taken about January, February. The baby sea hares look really very different from the adults. You see, the adults are big and dark and blobby. The little ones are bright red with a dark blackish line around the top of that central section of the parapodia, the big flaps in the middle. They also have little black tips to their various tentacles and little black eyes. They're really cute little things. This one is absolutely tiny. If you see the big sort of whitish, pinkish shape in the background, that is the tip of my nail. So this slug was maybe 2-3 millimeters long at most, but worth looking out for if you've got good eyes and you're on the shore. There are a couple of other sea hare species that we occasionally can see. There's a massive one called Aplysia fasciata that's sometimes found swimming. You sometimes get photos of big sea hare swimming alongside boats. And this one, Aplysia depilans, the central part, the flaps in the middle, are particularly high at the back on this species. But apart from that, I think it has a face that looks very much like a hippo. If you look at the one on the right, I don't know, I just have them down as hippo slugs. So worth having a look for. If you find some especially big sea hares, have a close look. These ones, as far as I know, as far as I've seen, don't tend to have that leopard print pattern in the way that the more common sea hare does. But yeah, worth looking out for. The slug we saw at the beginning, the feathered bertha. This one is quite a common slug. It gets bigger than that little sea hare I showed you. So it gets to, a few centimeters long, very bright yellow, so quite easy to spot. It's often just a bright yellow patch on a rock. And these ones, I have to think now, they feed on ascidians, I think, from what I've seen. My books are a bit vague on it. And the weird thing about the feathered bertha is that it has an internal shell. So right in the middle, there's a dark patch you can just about see in that photo. And that is a little shell that it's got inside it, which is fairly unusual for slugs. They just have these two rolled tentacles at the front and a little, what we call an oral tentacle, a little part underneath. But they're called the feathered bertha. It took me a long time to work this out. They're called the feathered bertha, the Berthella plumula, because their gill, which is held at the side of their body, looks very much like a feather. And you can see it in this photo tucked away under the body, the big long feathery gills. So that's why it's the feathered bertha, because when you just see the slug, it just looks like a blob. It doesn't look very feathery at all. So there you go. Okay, so there are lots and lots of other slugs that aren't nudibranchs that you might find on the shore. So those are just a few examples. We'll move on to the nudibranchs, the slugs with naked gills. So it gets very exciting at this point. And this sea lemon is demonstrating its big feathery gills on its back beautifully in that photo. That's a close-up of the gills of a sea lemon. So there's big feathery structures on the back. Nudibranchs may have a big cluster of gills like that, a rosette of gills, or they may have big long serrata. And we'll have a look at what those are. Using my appalling drawing skills, apologies for this, I thought rather than steal something off the internet, I ought to draw something, but that means you have to put up with my drawing. So nudibranchs have lots of different body plans. They can look very different, all sorts of bits growing out of different parts of their bodies. But some key things, that they all have a foot. So they're like a snail or a land slug that has a big long foot underneath, a muscly foot that they use to move about. Most nudibranchs will have something called rhinophores, which are the big tall antenna, if you like, on their heads. Those are the rhinophores. They may also have other tentacles. So this slug, for instance, has rhinophores here. It has some oral tentacles coming out the front of its head. And this one also has some little propodial tentacles sticking backwards there off the side of the head. Okay, you can often see the eyes. If it's a sea lemon or something similar, a Doris slug, it might well have a circle of gills on its back. Other slugs will have these sticky uppy things, which can be all sorts of different shapes, sizes and styles and colors, called serrata. And the serrata can be really interesting. They generally in slugs will function as gills, as digestive glands. and may also, in the case of some slugs, store secret weapons that they can use against attackers. So the serrata are interesting. The back of a slug is called the mantle. And on some of the slugs, particularly the aeolid slugs, you tend to have a tail that sticks out the back, and the coloration of that tail might be useful. So knowing what these bits are called can be quite helpful when it comes to identifying slugs, because like I say, they come in different colors, shapes, structures, and those are the things you have to look out for. For instance, the length, the comparative length, and any markings on the rhinophores, or the number of the gills, things like that. So moving on to the slugs themselves, this is where I get very excited. This is the great grey sea slug. There are a couple of species. The one we tend to get here in Cornwall is Aeolidia philomenae, the Phyllis slug, as I now call her. These slugs eat anemones. We saw one right at the beginning with its head into a snakelox anemone. And quite remarkably, they take on often both the colour of the anemone, and they can also retain the stinging cells, the nematocysts from the anemone that they've eaten, which provides them with a defence against possible predators. So although these slugs look very vulnerable and blobby, there aren't many things, it seems, that will eat them, because they look and often are poisonous or dangerous in some way to other animals. This photo shows you the difference between being out of the water and in the water. The one on the left, out of the water, all blobby, and on the right, you can see how much more clearly you can see the features of the slug once it's in water. I'd strongly recommend, when you're taking any photos of slugs, have a waterproof camera if at all possible, and get the slug into the water, ideally into a pool that's large enough for it to properly stretch out and explore, so that you can observe it properly. Okay, because once it's in the water, you're much more likely to be able to see any rhinophores or tentacles, markings. And this one, the philomenae, has a white V shape behind its head, as you can see here, that generally will have those white markings if it's that species. And long serrata, these slugs start off white to pale grey. If they've eaten a red anemone, they will often turn really sort of red, or like this one here looks like it had an anemone quite recently. There are a couple of very similar species, smaller ones. This is alderi, the Aeolidiella alderi, the white ruffed slug. And they're called that because they have a little white ruff of serrata just behind the head, which is often quite obvious. They're paler than the other serrata on the slug. Their body plan is very similar to the great grey slug, but they don't get anything like as big. They're much, much smaller. And you can see they come in a really big range of colours. The one on the left almost white, the one on the right has probably eaten a daisy anemone quite recently by the looks of it, and has that lovely white ruff contrasting with the orange and grey that it's stored in its body. So they can change colour a lot. I was really excited. This is a recent find for me. This is Aeolidiella glauca, which is supposed to be more of a northern species. I've never seen it before in Cornwall, although it can occur here. And of course, ironically, I found this one at Lizard Point, which you may know is the most southerly point in Britain, which is obviously where you go to find a more northern sea slug. The thing to look out for if you find a Aeolidiella slug that looks a little bit different is these little white spots in the middle of the back, all over the body of the slug. It had lots of these little white spots, which I'd never seen on the alderi slug. And according to Ian Smith, who I asked to check it, those are sort of the key defining feature to look for if you've got a Aeolidiella glauca. So that was exciting for me. That was just a month or so ago. Like I say, you can find slugs all year round. One of my favourites, actually fairly common slug to find on the shore and just fabulous. This is the Phaseolina auriculata. It used to be called coronata, if anybody's old school. We call it in our family the patriotic sea slug because it's red, white and blue. Those who know me know that I speak French at home, so it works whether you're British or French, the red, white and blue thing. You've got two slugs in this photo. They're both Phaseolina auriculata, so you can see the colour can vary a lot. These ones feed on hydroids, on little creatures with stinging cells. Weirdly, there was a paper I read a while ago about blue-rayed limpets, the little tiny limpets that live on kelp, and that there's a theory that their little blue rays that they have, those blue turquoise lines, make them look like this slug. And because these slugs are not good to eat, and creatures avoid eating them, they think that it gives some protection to the blue-rayed limpet. How true that is, I have no idea, but I thought that was a great little theory. They're just a stunning slug to see. Pretty distinctive, that red, white and blue in the serrata. They've also got a bit of a pinkish coloration, which is actually their digestive gland behind their heads. And their rhinophores, the bits on top of their heads, are ringed. They look like unicorn horns. So if you get to look up close, you can see that. I think all of these Phaseolina slugs look a bit like I don't know, circus ringmasters with big moustachy oral tentacles that go on forever. They're quite distinctive, very slender, elegant slugs. Another Phaseolina you could find on the shore, I've seen a few times now, is Phaseolina annulicornis, which is, I call it, this is not an official thing, but I call it the starry unicorn slug because it sounds nice. The annulicornis refers again to the ringed rhinophores, which in this species are set obliquely. So they're at a funny angle, those rings, a bit like a helter-skelter. The thing that distinguishes this slug, those little white spots, you see white spots all over the serrata, all over the body. So that's why I call it the starry slug, little spots of colour everywhere. Okay, that's a close up so you can see the rhinophores in that. They really do. I always think they look like unicorn horns, but that's what I'm like. Clearly I wasn't cut out to be a scientist. I see these things everywhere. Okay, this one is another new one for me. I'm sharing my exciting new things. This slug, I think, only started to be seen a few years ago around Cornwall, more of a southerly species, more common of the French Atlantic coast, the Pruvotfolia pseliotus. And this one, again, it's quite a similar shape to those Phaseolina slugs. And this one's got a spotty look going on as well. But if you look closely, the serrata on its back don't have any of those white spots like we saw on the last one. And they do this amazing thing where they're really long serrata. When I saw this slug, I thought it was an anemone. The serrata was so long, they look like big, long tentacles. And when the slug's moving about, it tends to curl these serrata right in, so it looks all curly in the middle, which I haven't seen on any other slug. It seems to be a real feature. And the body is covered in these beautiful little white spots as well. So a new one for me, and definitely one to look out for. I don't know if anyone's recorded it in South Devon. I'd have thought so. So look out for this one. But you see those lovely curly serrata in the middle. Fabulous things. Another species that's really worth looking out for. This photo shows you, it's not a very clear photo, apologies for the quality, but the big clump of white stuff on the left, the big sort of yellowy white patch, is the edge of a clump of sea lemon eggs. We saw the big gelatinous eggs of the sea lemon earlier. And just to the right of it, you can see a little white spiral. You can see that of spawn. And that spiral is the eggs of the Faverinus branchialis slug. And it lays its eggs next to the eggs of other sea slugs because that's what it feeds on. They can and do, I believe, eat other things as well. But whenever I've seen them, they've tended to be close to sea slug spawn, which is their favourite thing. Really distinctive thing to look for on these little slugs, because they vary a lot in color otherwise, are these brown rhinophores. The bottom half of the rhinophores on their heads is brown. And they also have, I call it like an onion dome shape. They're slightly swollen in the middle, about 2/3 of the way up. There's a sort of bulbous bit, which you can see quite clearly, I think, on these photos. And I do like a photo of a slug's bottom. This one was doing a strange kind of buckaroo trick for me. But you can see these rhinophores, brown rhinophores, especially on the bottom half, and quite bulbous, like an onion dome towards the top. So that's the Faverinus branchialis. So if you find some sea slug eggs, have a really close look to see if you can find a little Faverinus which might be feeding on them. I talk of things that feed on eggs. This is a calmer slug. Really beautiful slug, this one, actually. And it feeds on the eggs of the clingfish. If you've ever seen a shore clingfish before, perhaps they've got quite sort of duckbill face and 2 bright blue spots on their heads and a sucker underneath that they use to hold onto the rocks. And they lay lovely golden clusters of eggs, which this slug comes along and eats. This slug has already eaten quite a lot of eggs on this rock, and it's laid its spawn here. So all of that white stuff, all of those little white spots and coils that you can see all around the slug, those are the eggs of the slug. And you can see in its body, the little white spots in its body, that it's got a whole load more spawn that it's busy putting out there. So it's decided that's a great spot for clingfish eggs. It's really distinctive. It looks quite blue, has the bright yellow tips to its serrata, and you will pretty much always find it somewhere either with clingfish eggs or the remains of clingfish eggs. So those are the clingfish eggs, so you know what to look for. So I'd look for the food. Collections of often very, very bright yellowy orange eggs that are laid very neatly. Clingfish lay them one by one very neatly in a pattern on the rock. Another calmer slug from the same group also feeds on fish eggs. It's the calmer gobieuphagga, which is such an awful sounding name for a really fascinating slug. So this slug, as you can hopefully see, is wading through an absolute field of goby eggs. All those little black spots around it are the eyes of gobies, rock gobies, I think, in their little egg capsules. Goby eggs are always shaped like little capsules, like little space rockets. They're quite distinctive compared to other eggs on the shore. The thing you might notice about this calmer gobieuphagga slug is that the serrata, the standing up bits on its back, also look pretty much identical to the goby eggs, and some of them even have those dark black spots in them that look like the eyes of the goby. It's a very small slug. This is massively enlarged, this photo. So if you find some fish eggs on the shore, take some time to look really, really closely, ideally through either a hand lens or a camera that's magnifying it for you, so you can see if you can detect any movement. I did have to watch these eggs for several minutes before I was convinced that there was a slug there at all. Really quite hard to spot. This one, I think what gave it away, this one, you see the white in its back. That white again is all the spawn that it's holding in its body, ready to lay. And that's a feature of the calmer slugs. You can often see that spawn getting ready. They really are quite fascinating. This is a juvenile that's calmer gobieuphagga that's just starting to feed, so it hasn't got quite such strong colour in its serrata. They've got quite clear eye spots. You see, they're really, really hard to spot amongst those eggs because their serrata are the same shape as those goby eggs. You've got to feel sorry for the poor little baby gobies there, because they are, some of them will get eaten, and they're pretty vociferous, these slugs, but it's a fascinating thing to see. So slightly less gory maybe. Moving on to the eubranchus stroke ampharina slugs. A lot of these slugs have changed name recently. They were considered to be eubranchus, they're now ampharina, or vice versa, and they are absolutely beautiful little slugs, as you can see here. The feature to look out for with the Amphrena or Eubranchus slugs is they tend to have these really swollen, bulbous serrata on their backs. And the most common species, the Amphrena, tends to have these orange patches on its back, which are quite distinctive. The color can vary a lot. The Amphrena slugs are normally orange or yellow in color, but as you can see with this one, they can be black depending on the species. Okay, here's another one. You see the last one was blackish with white spots at the top of its serrata. This one much more orange. So this one is Amphrena ferrani. There's another very similar species called Amphrena andra, which often has black spots on it and doesn't have any orange on the tail. As you can see, they don't often show their tails particularly well. So, and they are tiny, these slugs. So good luck with telling them apart. Absolutely stunning little things. And this one is modeling the hydroid that it likes to eat. So the Amphrena slugs tend to eat hydroids, various different species. But if you find some little hydroids, these feathery things that you can see to the left of the slug, that's a really good place then to search for sea slugs, particularly this species. But equally, I found this one floating past me in the water. I just saw a tiny speck of orange that I thought might be something, scooped it up. And sure enough, it's this beautiful little Amphrena ferrani slug. To give you an idea of scale, it's worth having a hand lens or a visor like jewelers use, or a really good camera, because some of these slugs are almost impossible to see in any detail. And as you see, that 20p has been blown up quite a lot to enable you to see the slug, but that's the same slug as in that photo. Beautiful thing, but you need some kind of visual aid unless you've got superhuman vision to be able to see some. This is the Eubranchus exiguus slug, which again, another new find for me. Just a couple of weeks ago, I had a group down from Coastwise, North Devon, who came out with me around Loo, and on the very, very last day, on the Monday, which Toby came join me on the Sunday, I'm afraid this one was on the Monday, I spotted a really tiny slug that was almost impossible to see on a bit of seaweed, and thought it looked different from the normal Amphrena slugs, but something similar. You can see that's my finger in the background. That's my fingertip. So it gives you an idea of the size of this thing. It really was a couple of millimeters long, but really quite incredible. Strange sort of knobbly look to the serrata. They sort of go in and out like a Christmas tree or something. Lots of white spots all over it. And this again was like I've never seen before, the Eubranchus exiguus. There are quite a few Eubranchus species, and they are quite tricky to separate. So if you find one, do your best in the circumstances to get photos. You see mine are far from perfect, but good enough to see the shape of the serrata, the color, the rhinophores, those sorts of things. Okay, as always, it was on a bit of seaweed that was moving everywhere in the current, the slugs moving. It can be very difficult to get a really good photo. So do your best. Now this little slug was a new one to me last year, and then I saw lots of them, as is often the way with these things. This is the Trincisia foliata, which I'm not very good at remembering the Latin names if I don't associate them with something. So this became the three cheese foliage slug. The three cheese foliage slug doesn't eat cheese or foliage. It feeds on little hydroids, as far as I know. The thing that's really distinctive about this little slug, you see the little orange lines behind its head. It had these two very distinctive orange lines and lots of speckling on the body and the serrata, and nice orange band on the rhinophores on its head. Tiny little slugs. I'll show you again like what we're talking about in some photos, but really beautiful little things. Look at that, lovely orange markings on the head. Really fascinating little things. Now, again, here's a photo to show you what we're dealing with here. Obviously, if you're a beginner, go out there and find yourself a good sea hare, nice big blobby thing that will fill your hand, a Pathella plumula, it's a good few centimeters long. That's a great starting point. As you get more and more in slugs, you start to notice the tiny things. So there are a couple of 3 cheese foliage, Trintisia foliata slugs in this photo. There may be others that I've not spotted, of course. There's one, I'm not sure if you can see my pointer, but there's one here, and in the middle, where my pointer's hopefully now, if you can see it, is a little clutch of spawn. Okay, there's a little white semicircle, which is the spawn, and it's little bits like that that can often draw your eye. You sort of notice that, and then you notice the slugs, because as you can see, they are amazingly well camouflaged against the bryozoans, which possibly they're eating. So there's one here below the spawn to the left, and one just above the spawn. And there's a close-up of those 2 slugs, getting quite friendly, I think. And there's some spawn being laid. If you look at the top of the photo, there's a little coil of spawn being laid in that photo. So absolutely adorable little things. Ooh, let's get back. Oh, my doesn't want to go back. Right. Another really beautiful slug is the eddy, as we call it, the Edmondsella. It used to be a flabellina pedata, and is now an Edmondsella pedata. A lot of sea creatures generally are having their names changed as we find out more about the genetics of them, to work out what families they should be in. So be prepared that a lot of slugs, if you've got a book, like I've got I'll show you my books later, but I've got some books that are quite old, and probably at least half the names of the slugs have changed, but the slugs themselves haven't changed. So if you know what you're looking at, you can always look up the name later. And the eddy is always this fabulous purple color, that the body is purple, the rhinophores are purple, the sorata are purple with the little white tips. Really distinctive little slug. Here he is, little eddy. Fabulous little slug. These feed on hydroids, as far as I know. I wrote things down earlier to try and help me to remember what everything eats. But yeah, really distinctive. Quite small slug, but really quite. If you see it just out on a rock, you will spot it straight away, which makes it a good one to look for. Okay, and I do like a slug bum. This is a lovely fluffy bummed slug. So yeah, beautiful purple slug. Most of the way through. Now I've got a few more species still to show you though. These little dotto slugs, nobody seems to quite know for sure what they are. There are lots of dotto species. They are very similar and notoriously difficult to separate at the best of times. This little slug that I often see on the shore, really often see on the shore, if I look for it, and you won't see it unless you look for it, is possibly a dotto anusta. It feeds on, you can see this hydroid that looks like a sort of, again, like a little upside down Christmas tree, a little bit of fir tree branch. That's a Dynamine pumila hydroid, which are really common on, particularly on the brown seaweeds, on the racks. If you find a bit of saw rack growing on the rocks, and these slugs are often among them. See, out of the water, they look a bit sorry for themselves, but in the water, they've got these amazing jelly mold creations coming off their backs, the sorata. The rhinophores are weird. They look a bit like satellite dishes, really open and wide with bits sticking up in the middle, and there's beautiful crimson spots all around them. Pretty much all of the dotto slugs look a bit like this. So your best bet is to take a photo, particularly look at what they're eating, see what hydroid they're eating. That's really key to try and tell the different species apart. But yeah, if you find one, they're really tiny, but get it in some water, have a really close look, because they are just wonderful. I found one yesterday and it made my day. Again, on those little hydroids, you often see a little bit of white sticky stuff on the hydroid, and that's the spawn of the slug. So yeah, beautiful, amazing structures to them. We'll do a quick little scamper through some other species. This is Antiopella cristata, which used to be called Genolus cristata. My son found this one and was absolutely overjoyed with it. It does look like I don't know, a brilliant blue crystal, doesn't it? All those big long serrata on its back. Absolutely stunning little slug. The tips of the serrata are often very blue looking. They can be quite white, but this one was quite nice and blue. And you can see the dark lines up the serrata, which are the digestive tracts, I believe. So yeah, absolutely stunning. It's got a nice little blue tail. If you see right at the end on the left there, that's the slug's tail, which again has a little blue line, worth looking at. Move on to the more Doris type slugs. This is Girona tomentosa, which I always think looks like a little teddy bear. You can see the slug spawn, that lovely little white rosette of stuff in the background, just in front of a little scarlet and gold cup coral that's all closed up. So this is the Girona tomentosa. It can be very flat or very rounded. It seems to change shape quite a lot, but it's always sort of, if you look really close, it's got almost like little hairs on its back. It looks all fluffy, a bit teddy bearish. And it normally has little brown spots on it as well. And I know recently this has been separated, I think, into 2 species. I can't remember the name of the other one, but if you find one, take some good photos. I think one species has more of the brown blotches. But I've always called it the Dalmatian slug because it seems to always have some little brown spots on it, brownish rhinophores. And you can see in this one, you see it's like quite fluffy looking. That's the Girona tomentosa. And another fluffy little beast is the Rostranga rubra. That was one of the slugs that we saw straight at the beginning in the Spot the Slug contest, where we had the red sponge and a blob in the middle of that red sponge. This is the same thing. So you see, once it's in the water, it's completely transformed. It's very fuzzy looking and has these rhinophores, pale rhinophores coming out of its head. It very often has like a little band of white across its forehead, if you like, as well, between those 2 rhinophores, that has a sort of white stripe. So quite a small slug, but big enough to see, probably, a couple of centimeters long. So they're a good one to look out for. If you find any red sponges that they like to eat, have a close look for those blobs. If you find one, get it in water to have a good look. They're very common around the shore here in Lewes, so I imagine you have plenty in South Devon. My personal favorite. Okay, this slug used to be known as Disco Doris, which is just the most beautiful name, and I've always imagined my Disco Doris out at the disco. Changed quite a few years ago now to Gator Doris planata. And what's amazing about these slugs is that they have all these white starry patches on them, which are actually acid glands. We've seen slugs have lots of defenses, like the sea hares with their ink, like the great grey sea slug that eats the anemones and keeps the stinging cells. A lot of the other slugs also have toxins and things that make them not good to eat. This one, like the Bethella plumula as well, the yellow one that we saw at the beginning, can squirt out acid. If anything disturbs it, upsets it, it can excrete acid through these white pores that you can see here. The Gator Doris planata looks very similar to a sea lemon. It has kind of warty look to its back, a circle of gills on the back, rhinophores at the front. One of the things, if you're not sure whether you've got a Gator Doris planata or a sea lemon, is to have a look underneath, taking care not to get squirted with acid. And the sea lemon underneath is all one colour. It's all just a unique yellow colour or something like that. The Gator Doris planata always has these little browny, reddy spots underneath its mantle skirt. So it's quite distinctive if you're not sure. The white patches are also distinctive, but they're not always very clear. This slug can be yellow rather than brown, which makes it look much more like a sea lemon. But that's a pair of them. It's a mating pair in this photo. You've got 2 slugs, one coming towards the camera, the big brown one, and the other one on the left going away from the camera is quite yellow, and really looks quite like a sea lemon, just a bit flatter looking. And as you can see, those white spots are not at all distinct on the yellow one. But if you turn that slug upside down, the yellow one, you'll see that it's got those brown spots underneath.
Okay, it's just coming up to an hour actually, so
Brilliant. I'm on the
Cool.
last few slugs, so I'll skip through. I'll skip through
Fantastic.
some slugs. Perfect.
Thank you.
So this is the sea lemon, absolutely stunning slug. They feed on sponges, take on the colour. So quite similar to the other one. Their spawn, the big gelatinous spawn we saw earlier, can come in different colours. It might be yellow, it might be white, as these slugs beautifully demonstrated for me. This is one I've seen more in recent years, the Ocelligera, which looks very much like a tiny sea lemon, but has these sandy looking tubercles on its back. It really looks like it's got little grains of sand, and probably has got little grains of sand stuck all over it. So that's one to look out for. It feeds on sponges as well. That's it with its spawn. A couple to look out for this time of year, you start to see them laying their spawn, are the Goniodorus slugs. There's a red one, Castanea, and a white one, Goniodorus nodosa, which we call ghost slugs or petticoat slugs. They look kind of white and frilly. They can be pink as well, like that one. So, and the other Doris, the Acanthodoris, that looks like a tiny sheep with long tentacles. That one could be white or brown. We've got a really flat one, Knutsedonta depressa. So see, there are absolutely loads of these slugs that you can find on the shore. I surprised myself putting this presentation together by how many there were. So I'm sure we all love slugs, so I won't bore you too much with a million species. This one's lovely, Aegirus punctilucens. It's got those little spots of colour on it, little turquoise spots on it, which are rather lovely. It looks just knobbly, like a little bit of detritus, but quite a small slug. And Paleonothus is another, it looks a bit like, I always say that the Celtic sea slug looks like an armoured car, like a tank. And this one does as well, but with more frilly bits. It's got big helter-skelter rhinophores on it, big tall rhinophores. It looks like a little armoured car. That's one that I've seen increasingly in the rock pools recently. And I want to just the last couple of slugs now. The Polyceras. There are lots of species of these, but you get the four-lined one, like this one here, which can be yellow or black lines on its back. Really distinctive little slug with all the processes, the little sticky outy bits under the mouth. And this relatively newly separated species, which has just changed name, it's changed name twice in quick succession. It's now back to being Norvegica, the Norwegian slug again, that has little black spots all over it. And there are other white and yellow slugs as well, like this Ancula gibosa. If you find a white and yellow slug, take some really good photos, take a close look at the rhinophores, the colours on its back, on its tail, what its gills look like and the processes around the gills. Take photos of its mouth as well, the front of the head, to help you distinguish what it is. And there are some really good groups that I'll show you in a second that can help you with distinguishing what slugs you found. This orange club slug is quite a common one that we find on the shore. So that's a like really massive canter through the sea slugs that I've seen on the shore. And it's just a snapshot. There are lots of other species. There are plenty of species that I've never found, but that other people seem to find all the time on the shore. So depending on where you are and what sort of food is available, you might find quite different slugs from the ones that I've found. So just a little recap. When you're looking for slugs, look for the food, look for the things that you know they eat, look out for the eggs, the spawn, those coils or the pink silly string if it's sea hares. Get your slug, if you find a blob that might be a slug, put it into water, give it some time to extend and get its rhinophores out. A lot of those things retract in to the slug when it's out of the water. So give it time to become its best self. Take photos. And like with anything on the shore, you know, I'm all about leaving everything where you found it, doing your best to identify it in situ if possible, and putting it back afterwards, unless anybody has asked you to collect anything for science. Enjoy it, love it, and put it back exactly where you found it, because bless them, those little slugs don't move very fast. So if you found them somewhere they're probably there because they've got some food there, or that they've found a mate. Some things to look out for if you're trying to identify slugs. Dave Fenwick's A Photo Marine website is brilliant for identifying just about anything that you might find on the shore. Lots of photos of the species organised with the different species names. So compare your photos or what you found to that. The OPK Epistobranchis website, which is both in English and Catalan, I think, possibly Portuguese as well, is a great site with lots of photos and descriptions of slugs. And then the Facebook groups. If you've got a photo and you just want someone to identify it, put it on the Northeast Atlantic nudibranchs group or the Sea Search Identifications group, really. And you'll probably have an answer or several different answers, sometimes conflicting answers within minutes. There's lots of real experts on those groups. It's really helpful. Or if you think you know what it is, you want to double check it. And the final thing, make sure you get involved with your local marine conservation group. If you want to see slugs, go out with a group of people who are all looking for the same things, people who are knowledgeable, people who know where to look. It's often a lot more rewarding than just trying to find these tiny sea slugs on your own. Together you'll find a lot more and you'll share that knowledge together. Obviously I have to plug my books because my publisher likes that kind of thing. But yeah, as I mentioned at the beginning, I've got a couple of books out and I'll show you in a minute. I've got various other books that I use for identifying sea slugs if anybody wants to have a look, and I can always share those afterwards. So yeah, happy rock pooling.
Thanks, Heather. That was absolutely fantastic.